Hello and welcome back to the William Gomez podcast. I am William Gomez and I'm grateful to have you here. Today we turn to one of the most important ideas in psychoanalytic thinking, something that touches every part of emotional life, often without our awareness. It is the idea of fantasy. When we hear the word fantasy, we might imagine daydreams, vivid imagination, or escape from reality. But in the psychoanalytic sense, fantasy is something far deeper. It is the quiet structure that gives shape to desire. It is the frame through which we understand what we long for, why we long for it, and how we imagine the world of others. Fantasy is not a story we consciously invent, it is a pattern we inhabit. It lives beneath our choices, beneath our disappointments, and beneath our hopes. It offers a sense of stability in a world that would otherwise feel overwhelming. And more importantly, fantasy allows desire to have a place to rest, even if only temporarily. In this episode, we will explore what fantasy is, how it forms, how it supports desire, and how it shapes relationships, creativity, and emotional life. As always, we will take our time. We will walk gently through these ideas, not to master a theory, but to understand more deeply what moves within us as human beings. To begin, let us clarify something essential. Fantasy, in this sense, is not about escapism. It is not simply imagining a better life or indulging in stories. Fantasy is a structure. It organizes our inner world. It creates a scenario, a frame, a background image that helps us make sense of our desires. Fantasy gives desire a stage on which to play out its movements. Fantasy answers a question that every human being carries within them, a question that begins in childhood and continues throughout life. The question is, what does the other want from me? This question is not merely intellectual, it shapes how we see ourselves, how we feel around others, and how we interpret their actions. Fantasy provides an answer, even if the answer is not entirely true. It gives us a picture of our place in the world of others. Without this picture, desire would be destabilized. Fantasy gives desire direction. Fantasy begins early. As children, we receive messages from the adults around us, both spoken and unspoken. We sense their joy, their disappointment, their attention, and their absence. We begin to imagine what they expect from us. We create a picture of how they see us. This picture is never perfect. It is shaped by our own interpretations, by moments of closeness or distance, and by how we experience their love. But this early picture becomes the seed of fantasy. Fantasy continues to grow as we enter the world of language. Once we begin using words, we enter a system of meaning. We learn what is praised, what is discouraged, what is allowed, and what feels risky. We learn stories about who we are supposed to be. Thus, stories shape the structure of fantasy. They tell us in subtle ways how we believe we must act in order to be loved, accepted, or recognized. Fantasy also relates closely to desire. Desire, as we have discussed, is not aimed directly at objects. It moves around a gap, a sense of something missing. Fantasy is the structure that gives this gap a shape. It provides a scenario that allows desire to feel grounded. If desire is a restless movement, fantasy is the ground it runs upon. Without fantasy, desire would feel directionless, overwhelming, or unbearable. For example, imagine someone who desires affection. Their desire is not simply for affection itself, it is shaped by a fantasy of what affection means, how it should look, and what it represents. Another person may desire success, but their desire is shaped by a fantasy of what success says about their worth, their abilities, or their place in the world. In each case, it is not the object that holds the desire, but the fantasy that gives the object its meaning. Fantasy also gives shape to objet petita, the spark of desire we explored in the last episode. Objet petita is the invisible quality that makes an object desirable, but this spark cannot exist in isolation. It needs a frame, a scenario, a story that allows it to shine. Fantasy provides that story. It presents the object in a way that awakens desire. Without fantasy, the spark would have nowhere to land. This is why fantasy is not a random invention of the mind. Fantasy is a structure that protects desire from collapsing. It creates meaning where desire alone would feel overwhelming. It allows us to handle the intensity of longing by giving longing a familiar shape. Fantasy also plays a role in our relationship to the real. The real, as we discussed, is the part of experience that cannot be captured by language or image. It is the overwhelming, the unstructured, the unspeakable. Fantasy helps us manage this. It acts as a buffer between us and the real. It shapes the intensity of desire into something we can approach. It gives emotional life a frame that softens the sharpness of the real. This does not mean fantasy is a lie. It means fantasy is a necessary structure of the psyche. It gives order to what would otherwise feel chaotic. Let us think about how fantasy appears in relationships. Every relationship carries a fantasy, even if the people involved are unaware of it. We bring into relationships an image of what we believe love is, how we believe we should be treated, and what role we think we must play. These beliefs shape our emotional reactions. When someone does something that fits our fantasy, we feel seen. When they break the fantasy, we may feel hurt or confused. Fantasy also explains why people sometimes repeat emotional patterns. They may find themselves drawn to similar partners, similar conflicts, or similar disappointments. The repetition is not accidental. Fantasy offers a scenario that feels familiar, even if it is painful. It reassures the subject by providing predictable emotional landscape. Fantasy stabilizes desire by repeating the same pattern. This is why someone may stay in a situation that is not good for them. Fantasy is familiar. It is comforting in its predictability. It offers a sense of identity, even if that identity is limiting. Fantasy is not always positive. It can be protective, but it can also confine us. Fantasy also shapes how we present ourselves to others. We may believe that we must be strong, pleasing, intelligent, or self sufficient. These beliefs come from fantasy. They represent the role we imagine we must play in the eyes of the other. Fantasy tells us how we believe we must appear in order to be loved. Fantasy also influences enjoyment. Enjoyment is not simply pleasure, it is a thrill, the intensity, the energy that comes from participating in the fantasy structure. Even when a situation is difficult, the fantasy may sustain enjoyment because it aligns with the deeper structure of desire. This is why people sometimes find themselves attached to emotional patterns that do not seem rational. Enjoyment is linked to fantasy, not to logic. Fantasy is not fixed. It can shift, evolve, or collapse. When a fantasy collapses, the person may feel lost or anxious. The collapse can occur when a situation no longer fits the fantasy or when desire changes and the old fantasy no longer holds meaning. This collapse can feel unsettling because the frame that once supported desire falls away. But collapse can also open a space for new fantasies, new ways of understanding desire, and new possibilities for emotional life. It is important to remember that fantasy is not something to eliminate. It is part of the human condition. Without fantasy, desire would feel chaotic. Without fantasy, our relationships would lack depth. Without fantasy, our inner world would feel empty. The goal is not to destroy fantasy, but to understand it, to recognize when it supports us and when it limits us. Fantasy can become more flexible when we approach it with awareness, when we begin to recognize the patterns we repeat, the roles we assign ourselves, and the expectations we carry. We gain freedom. We begin to see that fantasy is a frame, not a destiny. We can move within it. We can soften it. We can reshape it as we grow. Let us return now to the deeper question: what does the other want from me? Fantasy answers this question by offering a picture of our place in the world of others. But no fantasy can ever fully answer it. The desire of the other is always partly unknown. It is this unknown aspect that stirs anxiety, curiosity, and longing. Fantasy protects us by providing a partial answer, but the unknown remains quietly shaping our emotional life. And fantasy also carries a hopeful quality. It allows us to imagine possibilities beyond the present moment. It allows us to envision futures, relationships, and ways of being that inspire us. Fantasy gives us the freedom to dream, to create, and to grow. Even when fantasy does not become reality, it guides our path. It shows us what we value, what we fear, and what we long for. Fantasy can also soften suffering. When someone feels lost, fantasy can offer a sense of direction. When someone feels overwhelmed, fantasy can offer meaning. When someone feels disconnected, fantasy can create a bridge between their longing and their lived experience. And as we move toward closing this episode, I invite you to reflect on your own fantasies, not as escapist stories, but as structures that shape your intimate emotional life. What patterns do you repeat? What roles do you find yourself adopting? What expectations do you hold about yourself or others? These patterns are clues to your fantasy, and understanding them can open a pathway toward greater self compassion and deeper insight. Fantasy is not something to fear, it is something to explore gently. It is part of what makes us human. It offers a space where desire can breathe, where longing can take form, and where emotional life can find meaning. In our next episode, we will explore identification, the ways in which we become who we are through the images, roles, and signifiers that surround us. Identification shapes our sense of identity, our relationships, and our inner world. It helps explain why we feel pulled towards certain roles and why we resist others. But for now, I hope this reflection on fantasy brings you closer to understanding how desire moves within you and how the quiet structures of fantasy give shape to that movement. Thank you for listening. This is the William Gomez podcast. Take care of yourself, stay curious, and I will speak with you again soon.